Hello, Céline. Can I start by asking you why you consider international regulatory cooperation important today?
Well, hi, Mariana. In my view, international regulatory cooperation is more than ever essential because there is a big disconnect between the increasingly transboundary features of our activities and the largely national anchorage of rules that are usually embedded into laws and regulations. So to give you examples, we trade, we buy goods on platforms that are shipped from all over the world. We travel, we send and we gather data from anywhere. Our activities produce air or water pollution that crosses border. And for the current example is very telling in a way, the virus can spread across borders regardless of the administrative barriers. And at the same time, to a large extent, the rules and their enforcement remain largely determined at the national level. So that disconnect sometimes can be confusing and costly, like typically when a citizen or a business has to comply with different sets of rules. But sometimes it can be downright, ineffective. If, for example, it is enough to change location to avoid a rule like taxation or anti-pollution requirements, for example. So in my view, this forces policymakers to focus on the interoperability of their regulatory frameworks. It is a question of effectiveness, again, of efficiency, so reducing the cost for everyone involved, but also of administrative capacity that can be multiplied through joining efforts with other jurisdictions, but also ultimately of credibility of the public action.
Thank you. And you, so of course you were leading the work on international regulatory cooperation at the OECD for almost 10 years. And so you saw the evolution of countries' practices throughout this time. What priorities do you see still for countries to face to improve international regulatory cooperation?
Well, to me, the current crisis has demonstrated that the reflex is still very much to look inward for solutions. Even if, again, like it is the case now, a pandemic is the perfect example of a problem that governments cannot tackle in isolation, be it in terms of border control, ensuring the continuity of supply of essential goods, coming up, testing and distributing vaccines, for example. So that, inward-looking reflex means that while there can be a realization of the importance of cooperating on rules during a time of pandemics or crisis, it is extremely difficult to establish the cooperation framework and the mechanisms while fighting the crisis. So looking ahead, and in terms of priorities, I hope that if there is a silver lining to the current crisis, it is the awareness that the IRC framework needs to be established in time of peace in a way. And establishing the IRC underpinning is part of the future resilience of the regulatory frameworks of countries. And if you reflect on what countries should be doing to establish that IRC framework, I think the OECD work on the topic, in particular the work that has been done with countries, monitoring what countries have been doing in terms of IRC practices, we can see a very fragmented approach to international regulatory cooperation. It is very often down to each ministry, public agency, almost policymaker to put in place their own IRC mechanisms without a global vision of the various possible ways of ensuring the interoperability of rules. And so in my view, having a coherent approach via a policy, a strategy, and overarching policy document can help the efforts, guide the efforts, capitalize on the success, gather the information on failures and success as well. And then, there's a big margin everywhere in the world for policymakers when developing, new initiatives, laws and regulations to actually consider the international environment and cooperate with their peers to gather the intelligence and come up with coherent approaches. There's also a vast world of international organizations and initiatives that provide platforms for cooperation on rules. Name a topic and there's an IO that exists out there. And those are very important mechanisms for countries to exchange information, agree on the science, reflect, and come up with a joint approach and rules, monitor, and sometimes support implementation. And while, these are very important mechanisms, I think, there's a lot that countries can still do to fully empower them and invest in them, hence to me the importance of the platform that the OECD has established with the Partnership of International Organizations for Effective International Rulemaking.
Thanks, Céline. And one last question to you. As the author and initiator really of all these IRC best practice principles from the Secretariat side of the OECD, how do you think these best practice principles can help to address these challenges?
To me, these best practice principles are most likely the first international tool that has been developed in support of international regulatory cooperation. So they build on the extensive work done by the OECD in this area, and they highlight, areas and practices that countries can focus on to improve international regulatory cooperation. So in a way, they can help by providing within a country and across countries a shared language and terminology, by clarifying the possible approaches to regulatory cooperation from, full-fledged joint rulemaking to mutual recognition approaches to the adoption of international standards. And they also identify critical practices that countries can adopt to embed more firmly international regulatory cooperation within their rulemaking system. And also, I think, countries can use these best practice principles to actually self-assess, or for the OECD to conduct reviews so that the strengths and the gaps of any particular jurisdiction can be identified and recommendations can be made. But in my view, there's still so much more that can be done to implement beneficial IRC, where it makes sense that the BPPs, in a way, are only the first step.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your time, Céline.
Thank you.